It's November 19, 2024. I'm Gloria Nussbaum, and I'm talking with Gord Friesen of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, via Zoom about his involvement with Mennonite Disaster Service. Gord, I'm delighted to have you join me, and I look forward to hearing some of your stories. First off, when and how did you first learn about Mennonite Disaster Service?
Well, it's good to be with you. And as a little kid, I learned about MDS because my dad was involved early on in the beginnings of MDS in Manitoba and Canada in the early 50s. In fact, he helped relocate some people as part of MDS, I believe, in 1950 when the Red River flooded. The Red River is a big river coming from Minnesota, North Dakota, flowing into Canada. And we're in a big floodplain. And there was a big flood in 1950. So I don't remember that response, but I know my dad has talked about it. Then when I was an adolescent, he took me along on a work trip somewhere in southern Manitoba where a twister had ripped apart a barn. And I helped pull the barn boards, all the timbers, etc., apart as I don't know, maybe I was 12 or so, 13, as part of a big crew of, I would say, all men and boys. That was my first experience responding to a disaster and involved with MDS.
So it's been kind of a lifetime thing for you.
It has been. My dad was involved all his adult life in MDS wherever he was, in Manitoba and BC. Yes, so I grew up with knowing about MDS, but I had no other personal involvement after that childhood experience till 1997. I had just quit about 25 years of corporate work as a human resources and labor relations specialist. I helped build Boeing commercial aircraft. That was my paid job, and I quit gainful employment in 97 at my 50th birthday because I was tired of corporate life and I wanted to do something else, and I could, and my wife thought I could, and I wanted to volunteer at something. I just didn't know what, but I wanted to leave the corporate world. So the Red River flooded again in 97, a very drastic flood called the flood of the century. And it filled up a lot of southern Manitoba, maybe up to 30, 40 miles wide at places. And there was a lot of devastation. And seeing I was just, quote, unemployed, I didn't call it retired, but I was not working. And my dad happened to be in the area, and he said, Gord, you should get involved. And so I had project management experience. I had some building and construction experience, and I guess a lot of problem solving experience. So I agreed to join this committee that was forming right during the cleanup phase in the summer of 97, and I did house assessments initially, driving through the devastated areas and seeing what was what in terms of homes. And then I was asked if I would be the project manager for the rebuild of the Red River Valley. And so after much consideration and a bit of pressure, I did agree to try that out, to take that on, even though it was my first involvement really with MDS in any way. And it was as a volunteer, of course. And I became involved for 3 solid years in helping to lead that response.
Can you give me a couple of examples of the kinds of things that you were involved with or that the volunteers were working at for that period of time, or maybe specific people that come to mind?
Well, Abe Enns was, I think, the Canadian chair and the Manitoba lead, and a person by the name of Sid Reimer, who had been involved over many decades in MDS. He was also involved, and he lived in the Red River Valley. Those are two names that come to mind in particular. And my personal involvement started, as I said, with doing street assessments, looking at homes. And then I started doing casework. People referred to our committee. We formed a committee, a special needs committee, I would say, but it was all in-house within the Mennonite world. It didn't involve other community representatives, although I would say Red Cross was probably part of it and Salvation Army, but not churches or community reps as we tend to know them in other special needs committees in various communities. It was more in-house, driven by MDS, I would say. And so I did a lot of the casework, interviewing people who were referred to our committee by the municipalities, by social workers, by other involved people. And also we had a disaster financial assistance organization within the provincial government that was also providing assistance and identifying gaps in people who weren't necessarily eligible for assistance or who were falling through the cracks for some other reason. So I would tend to do most of the casework, and I would bring those cases to our committee, and we would decide whether we might assist in terms of rehabbing, rebuilding, or building new, or not at all. So it was a case-by-case consideration, which is always the situation. We had a lot of money donated to us by generous supporters. At least $1 million was donated, and this was unheard of for us. The scope was so big, so we needed to also deal with these funds, invest them in the flood response. And so we had a small office that MCC Canada loaned to us, and they seconded a administrative support person, and we hired a bookkeeper because we had like hundreds of files open over those 3 years, and we had all this money to account for. And so I did a lot of the initial casework, and I ended up finding crew leaders and pretty well supervising all of the work that was being done during those 3 years.
During that time, were you able to stay in Winnipeg? You could continue to live there and work from there at least some of the time, or did it involve a move for you?
No, it was all, I stayed at home, and I was traveling just within like 100 kilometers, within about an hour's range at most. So yeah, that was a benefit. It was weird because we had primarily day volunteers throughout this piece. It got thinner in wintertime because we have a lot of cold here, and our volunteer supply got thinner in wintertime, but we continued with smaller number of projects during the winter. And in summer, we were greatly assisted by Christian Reform Church, which has a disaster response organization as well. And we kind of informally contracted with them that we would set up a operation and residential facility for them in 2 of the summers, summer of 98 and 99. And they would bring volunteers who would stay about a month at a time, together with their own crew leaders. And so that supplemented our local volunteers. Those people came from across Canada. So that helped a lot in getting the work done. In total, we renovated about 100 homes and built at least 10 brand new homes. During this time, there was also a lot of flood mitigation happening because flooding had happened many times before. And so there were billions of dollars invested in people raising their houses, building levees or dikes around their rural properties if they had room, and putting new basements at a higher elevation. There was a lot of money available, and that was used and well used. And there hasn't been a home that has been threatened since, even though the floodplain is still there.
That was actually one of my questions. Were there some changes in how people were building? So that's good to hear. It sounds like from the very beginning, you were, quote unquote, plunged into a leadership role with MDS.
You could say that, yes.
And then those leadership skills moved on to other things as well. I understand that you were on the board of directors and then the Region 5 chair. Talk a bit about the transitions or how some of those things came about.
Well, it was kind of a natural, through this 3 years, I got to know the local MDS folks, including the unit committee. And I joined that committee, and I may have been chair of the Manitoba unit for a bit. I can't recall exactly. But then I got onto the Canadian board as well, which was called Region 5. We were a region of the binational at the same time as being a national organization. So I was chair of the Region 5 board for quite some years as well. And it was just kind of an evolution, taking on, I guess, increasingly more responsible or more involved roles in the organization within Canada. And I guess more and more it also got me involved in the binational workings, because a lot of our activity, our volunteer base, fed U.S. disaster responses as well as in Canada, particularly in wintertime. Canadians love to go a bit south to share their service abilities, and they were much needed on U.S. project sites. I would say that eventually I got onto the binational board, and I was on that board for quite a number of years, up till 2012. And that's when I left the board. I retired after 15 years of working with MDS, not full-time, but very extensively.
And all of that was volunteer.
Yes.
I understand from a recent interview that I did, it was in 1998, I believe, that MDS separated from Mennonite Central Committee. So you were involved right at the beginning of when all of that started to happen or took place. Do you have any stories about that part of the organizational history?
Well, it was a very difficult time, I would say, because it didn't come up so much until, I would say, maybe 9/11, when there was a lot of activity, and it was a big, big, big deal in 2001. Up till then, we had worked at going our separate ways, but being kind of sister organizations. So that had a lot of implications, and we had leaned quite heavily on MCC administrative people and resources up till then, which I only learned about as I got more involved with MDS. But as we became more independent, there were difficult times, especially when it came to how money would be spent. And maybe that's human nature. But we found this particularly in the 9/11 area time period, and then later in the Katrina scenario. But we did find our way as friendly, cooperative fellow agencies.
And I understand that you had some involvement in Washington, D.C. with regard to the 9/11 tragedy. Talk about that, please.
Yes, it's kind of strange. We weren't obviously going to rebuild any towers or the Pentagon, but like always, MDS supporters donated very much money in Canada as well as in the US to this cause. And these were designated funds that needed to be spent on that disaster. So how were we going to get involved? And I wasn't really part of Binational, particularly at that point, but it was decided that Canadian funds, that the response would be smaller in DC than in New York City. And so there were also fewer funds that came in Canada than in the US. So it was decided that the Canadian funds would be focused on DC responses to 9/11, and US donations would go toward New York responses. So I represented Canada on the DC response, together primarily with Paul Unruh. And we always had Joe Steiner in the background, giving us guidance and helping us along. We, of course, never had any experience with this kind of disaster. Although we had a lot of money, we had to figure out how to invest this wisely.
With regard to this money that came in to MDS, both US and Canada, after 9/11, help me understand, did MDS put out any kind of a plea for money, or was this something where the constituency knew about this tragedy and just started to give money because, well, it's MDS, and if there was ever a disaster, this fit the bill? Can you talk about that at all?
We virtually never in a history when I was involved solicited for funds at all.
For 9/11?
For MDS, period.
Oh, okay.
The money just always came in when there was a disaster. And so we didn't in this case either, but it came in. The funds just poured in. And it was quite shocking with this kind of a disaster that people would feel so compelled to donate money. But we had this, it's not a problem, but it became quite a challenge on how to utilize these funds.
So what did you
help
do?
People. Well, MCC, as is always the case with any disaster, the first we check on in the neighborhood is where are the churches and who are the churches? And we'd start with Mennonite churches or affiliated Anabaptist type churches if we had an inkling that there might be some in an area that was affected. In this case, MCC happened to know that there were over 20 Mennonite affiliated churches in the New York City area and over 20 in the DC area. So we had a starting point. We would try to work with these churches to kind of ascertain what we might do, because they were local, they were in place. So Paul and I went to DC and we made contact with many of these pastors, mostly very small churches, mostly non-white churches. A lot of them were quite tiny, but vibrant. They had things going on. So we met with them individually and we asked them, how has 9/11 affected your congregation or your neighborhood? Well, they could speak about some racial tension, maybe. As you recall, there was some of that going on in the communities, especially anti-Muslim. And there were people that were affected socioeconomically, but the pastors really didn't know this particularly at the outset. So we asked them to look for certain signs within their congregations and their communities as to what possible impact 9/11 had. And then we would be back in about a month and we'd meet with them again. And we met with them, some individually and as big a group as we could find, as we could gather together. And by then, they knew all kinds of examples how people were devastated socioeconomically by 9/11. Most of these people in their congregations were at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale. They were in service industry jobs. And these jobs, the service industry kind of shut down after 9/11. The hotels, the catering, the taxis, the basic service industry, all travel kind of shut down for quite a while. So people lost their jobs, people in their congregations, and their rents were being threatened, their apartments, their houses, mortgage payments, even like as bad as grocery bills. So there was a lot of personal hurt, even though there wasn't any, direct trauma from the plane hitting the Pentagon. In a way, these pastors were asked to form a committee that would explore various needs that people had, as well as look at what kind of needs a church might have in terms of community ministries. Some of these churches had been dreaming of some community-based ministries but could never afford them, never had money. Some had buildings that were in bad shape and needed some upgrading. And we, of course, had a whole bunch of MDS volunteers chafing at the bit in eastern U.S. who had no work to do in repairing in either New York City or in D.C. So a few of those churches also got the benefit of some MDS volunteer work for improving their church buildings. So it was all over the place, but generally there were guidelines established for how people could apply locally for funds, either on a personal basis or a church basis. And I can't recall any just totally community-based organizations, but they were all linked to one of the churches or another. And so that's how we dispersed, or the local pastors dispersed, a lot of this money.
Can you give me maybe one or two specific examples of how this happened or what you funded?
I know there were people who we funded 2 or 3 months of rent so that they could keep their accommodation till hopefully the job market would turn around. There was a small church. You wouldn't even think of it as a church necessarily. A whole house, a 3-story building in a gentrified neighborhood where there was a small congregation of a few Asian people who were running this community church effort, trying to make peace between the Black people who lived in the area who were very poor and the Asian store owners who were very aggressive. And there was all kinds of tension in the community. And this little church entity, they were trying to make a difference in the community by having community events and beautifying some of the streetscape, putting in flower beds and stuff in boulevards and having street picnics and giving out drinking water. They weren't zoned to have congregational meetings, so there were a lot of one-on-one and small meetings at the front gate of the front yard. And they also employed people in the neighborhood. One person who was a homeless person, he was hired as a security guard, and he slept in their doorway and provided a service to them, which you might think of as being a little disrespectful maybe, but that was his job, and he could be paid for it by the congregation. There was another person who knew how to do oil changes but had no garage, but there was a spare lot, and the church got a ramp, and he could book oil changes for people. And then these church folk would visit the store owners and try to help them understand that part of the tension related to their behavior, not only to the customer's behavior. So it was a very unique kind of church. The third floor had bridal gowns, which were leftovers from some wedding store, and women could go there and pick out a free wedding dress. And they had a community newsletter. So that's one very unique place that we helped. And this person who was from China, he had come to AMBS because he wanted to learn about peace building. And he graduated from AMBS, and then he had this burning desire to set up some kind of a church or community ministry in DC. And he explored for about a year before he set up this little organization. So it was such a delight to spend time with him and his small circle of congregants.
And just to clarify what AMBS is?
Oh, sorry, it's the seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. He had checked out who teaches about peace building, and this was recommended to him as a good place to go.
What an amazing story. I mean, who would ever think that MDS was involved with a secondhand bridal shop?
I know.
Obviously, this tragedy, this disaster, MDS and I'm sure many other organizations needed to figure out how can we be helpful and had to think outside the box, obviously.
Well, even more so when we had some funds left over, probably both in New York and in DC. They did similar things in New York, but I can't really speak to that. Others probably have or will. But there was this idea that some of the pastors were very traumatized, not just from this disaster, but being in leadership roles, trying to shepherd their congregations through disasters of various kinds. And so there was a need identified, and I think Joe Steiner was a big part of that, and Paul as well, in terms of establishing what became the STAR program at Eastern University. It was a program that was set up to mentor or to give care to traumatized pastors wherever in the world they might come from. But it was focused generally on North America at the start. But some of our funds actually went to start that STAR program, which probably is still in existence today. I haven't checked lately. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it was a very progressive and leading edge kind of activity, I think, or program. So that's very far afield for MDS.
So how long, for what period of time did you feel like you were sort of actively involved in the recovery of 9/11? Was that months, years?
Over a year, yeah, because this rolled out slowly. And yeah, I would say I would be involved maybe for a year or so, off and on, yes.
You have a story about the actual events of 9/11 and where you were. So why don't you tell me that story?
I was at my first project leadership seminar training session in MDS in September '01, on the very day that 9/11 happened. And I was part of a group that was going to be future project leaders, I guess. And on day 2, I believe, it was a Tuesday, 9/11 happened. And of course, it was the end of our training session. Joe Steiner was leading it. And we were, of course, all in shock. And I was the only Canadian that was in Akron for this training session. And I was like trapped. I couldn't get home, and I wanted to get home very badly. I wanted to get into Canada, and there was no way. The planes were shut down, the trains, the buses were full, people were moving, but I was landlocked in Akron. So eventually I was able to get a ride to Chicago, and I was able to rent a car in Chicago, and I drove all the way from Chicago to Winnipeg nonstop through Minneapolis and North Dakota. And I felt really good to be back in Canada, but I was not able to do that for a number of days. So it's kind of strange.
And we'll just clarify again that the Akron you were in was Akron, Pennsylvania, where at that time the MDS headquarters were located.
That's correct, yes.
As we're finishing up here, you have obviously given a lot of time and effort, blood, sweat, and tears to MDS. What have you received from MDS?
Well, in addition to seeing a lot of Canada and seeing all the people, all the volunteers, and all the leaders in Canada and across the US who have helped to make MDS work, primarily as a volunteer organization, that has been outstanding, unbelievable to me. I spent a lot of time, helping with capacity building across Canada in particular, and troubleshooting at many disasters across Canada and the US. And everywhere we had an oversized reputation. We had volunteers who, a lot of the homeowners could not believe why people would help other people like them. They were always astounded why people did this for nothing, for no pay. So to me, it was just like the perfect Christian service idea where we were doing things and showing when we were asked, we could explain what our motivation was. And that didn't have anything to do with personal reputation. It only had to do with serving God. And so we had many young people who came to volunteer who learned some basic skills which probably stood them in good stead for the rest of their lives. Even a little bit of drywalling, a little bit of work with tools, even if they weren't going to be in building activities. So from the volunteer perspective, it was just kind of almost an endless stream of interested people wanting to help. And they were learning skills. We often started every day with not knowing what skills we had for that day or for the next week. But we figured it out, and we accomplished through the volunteers and through local leadership too, which we tried to draw out, many tasks and many rebuilt homes, including those that eventually were engineered to sustain more storm damage, which was, there were a lot of things that evolved in terms of house design and disaster responsiveness. So what I learned was that there's just an endless outpouring or ability of people to do good things when they get together in smaller or larger groups, and that the donors were always so generous.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, there was one unique response we had, which was to a drought of helping farmers in the prairies when they had several years of sustained drought. And we were asked, what can you do? What can you do to help? It's a disaster. Well, it wasn't our typical disaster, although MDS has helped with feed drives before in the US, I believe, maybe in Canada. But Abe Entz and I traveled through Saskatchewan and Alberta interviewing farmers and pastors in areas that were kind of heavily occupied by Mennonite areas. And we were trying to see how we could help. And so we had some listening sessions. We even had a few seminars and conferences, and we were trying to see what we could do. And then we eventually formed a bit of a telephone service where farmers in Alberta and Saskatchewan could put in a request for a certain feed for their cattle, and then others in Manitoba and Ontario could also offer their feed if they had excess, and then we would link the farmers together. So that was another totally different kind of response than you might think of with MDS. So it was, and we're very agriculturally oriented as a people, so that seemed to be a good fit, and I'm sure it has happened afterwards as well. It has been repeated.
But somebody has to figure out that there's a problem or hear about it and make some kind of, or at least attempt some kind of response. And it's wonderful that MDS is there and available and willing to at least explore these possibilities, it seems to me.
We also had a pandemic in, it was called the swine flu or the H1N1, and MDS Canada was asked to represent Mennonite Church Canada in putting together some resources for pandemics for churches to use. And Canadian Council of Churches, Mennonite Church Canada was a member of that organization. And so we developed, and this is really outside of the normal mandate of MDS, we developed some pandemic-related resources for congregations, which was used and pulled out again when COVID hit. And that was a nice little reminder that some things that sit on the shelf for a while actually may be useful sometime in the future.
Well, Gord, thank you so much for sharing all of these wonderful insights about some of the hidden corners, but really important work of Mennonite Disaster Service. Thank you, too, for all of your years and years of wonderful service. And thank you for taking the time to share these priceless stories.
Thank you, Gloria.